Hello and welcome. My guest is one of those people you read about, you hear about, but you don't often see doing a full-length interview on television. He's one of those people who's had one of those interesting backgrounds that's taken in the arts, that's taken in many different things. He could have been pretty much anything he chose to be. He chose to go into business, and he's created this huge and interesting empire. So let's talk to Anand Mahindra. It's actually true, isn't it, that you could have been anything, you didn't have to be a business person?
You know, you just paid me the ultimate compliment I've been searching for all my life.
And that compliment is?
Well, the compliment is that I could have done well at anything I tried my hand at.
That's true, isn't it?
I think it is, Vir, and I suppose that's the reason why I studied filmmaking as an undergraduate. I believe I did it because I was so uncomfortable with the prospect of going through a career in business, and at the end of it all, the epitaph being he worked for his father. And so big
He
deal.
became a millionaire at the age of 21 when his father transferred the money.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. And I just couldn't cope with that notion. So I think I did something so different where people would look at me later, and if I ever faced that kind of perception, I would say, look, I could have done anything I wanted to do. And I'm delighted you started the interview with that.
I've known you for a long time. I think people often miss the fact that your background is not strictly business. Your father had a deep commitment to public service. He was a member of the Congress Party. He was treasurer of the Bombay Congress Party at a time when businessmen didn't on the whole have very much to do with the Congress Party. Your mother's an author, written very successful books, some of which I have read. So you came from a very interesting background, didn't you?
I did, and you know what I would hope is that when tomorrow the template of tomorrow's businessman is going to be considered or thought about, I hope this will help people break free from a mold of thinking that the prototypical businessman is somebody who, you know, fast-tracked, who did the equivalent of becoming an entrepreneur when they were 5 by selling lemonade on their doorstep, and then went at 15 to work with their parents, then went on to Goldman Sachs, then went on to business school, and so on and so forth. So I'm hoping that I won't in the future be somebody who broke the mold, but maybe will be maybe a forerunner of what could be a mold.
The creator of a new mold almost. When you were growing up, were conversations on the dining table about business? What were they about at home?
You know, it's interesting. Very rarely. Very, very rarely. My mother came from a very modest background. Her father was an income tax inspector somewhere in Lucknow. She was a large family, taught herself English, became a professor at IT college, left to join the film industry in Mumbai, and then quit, and then became a self-taught author, photographer, golfer. She was very much an overachiever. And all that mattered to her and to my father as well was that, look, education. Education is the only treasure and the only wealth we can pass on to our children. It's the only thing they can hang on to, and that has some kind, that is not ephemeral. Right. And I think when you grow up with that, then you don't have a home or a dining table where everything is about bottom lines or ROI.
Right.
And I think I benefited from that.
Nice to know your father a bit in the 70s and the early 80s. And my lasting sense of him was that unlike many other businessmen of that era, of any era, he did have this sense of a commitment to society, of giving back long before it became fashionable. Was that your sense as well?
Absolutely. And it's a legacy I think I'm very proud of, and I believe I have a commitment to sustain. In fact, that giving back, the only thing that I have tried to do is to focus the group's CSR and philanthropy on education, simply because we are not so large that we can do multiple things well. And there is a trend in philanthropy now that if you're going to do something, understand what you're giving to, be an intelligent donor, be somebody who can add value to the initiative that you're fostering. And I think that's what we've done. So if you look at the Mahindra Group's initiatives, most of them now are focused in and around education.
All right. When we talk about the way you were brought up, etc., you talked about filmmaking as a career. How did your parents react to that?
They were delighted, and you know, when I looked,
they were delighted. That's very unusual in a business family, isn't it?
Because they felt that this was something to do with creativity, with myself, that I would strike out my own path. And there's a reason for it. My father went to Harvard and then to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He wanted to be a diplomat, and circumstances forced him into business. He was an accidental businessman, if you will. And so he really was determined that he was never going to force me into anything. So for him, the act of my doing something different, striking out my own, was in fact refreshing. He was a movie buff, so he envisioned a lifetime of free movie tickets, and I think he was very dismayed when I decided to go back into business. And my mother was a creative person, as you yourself noted, so they were extremely comfortable with the thought. And when I look back, Vir, and you were talking in the introduction about business and doing what I can, doing what I do well, there are links. The fact is that when you have a background where your parents merely give you confidence, right, and not tell you which path to go down, but just bring you up in a manner to convince you that you can do anything you want, that you have to think about something, but when you're ready, trust yourself and take the leap. If you have that kind of mindset, then frankly, as far as I'm concerned, you can end up doing well in whatever field you want. And it might actually be a help in being innovative in business, right, in taking risk. Entrepreneurialism or intrapreneurialism is about risk, isn't it? And it's about having the confidence to take risk. So arguably, even though my background wasn't one of dining tables filled with Excel spreadsheets and talk about balance sheets, is that kind of background of creativity one that fosters innovation and risk taking? I'd like to think it was.
When did you decide to get back into business then?
Well, I made a film, a thesis film, and I made it on the Kumbh Mela here. These were the 70s, you got to remember, sure, very artsy-fartsy days. So I filmed myself coming back and meeting an ascetic, a sadhu here. Very esoteric subject. I mean, I'd cringe if I had to see it again right now. But it did very well from the thesis grading point of view. And I felt a sense of release. And that's when I realized what I had been doing, that I was proving a point to myself. And at that point I realized, maybe my antipathy or my resistance to going to business was artificial. And I said, there's a lot of room to be creative in business as well. I had a strong sense of legacy, but now legacy not imprisoned by inevitability. It was voluntary. It was a choice. It was a choice. And suddenly when it became a choice, I realized it was a profession I was attracted to.
When you joined your dad, you joined with Mahindra, Eugene, etc.
Right.
Did you ever have a sense that you'd take over the whole group? Because it wasn't by any means clear.
Not at all. People who know the group look back, and the reason why our family has remained together, first of all, it wasn't very large, but the reason why my father and my uncle remained together was because very early on, they decided to carve up their areas of responsibility. So my father decided that he would put up the steel plant because his father before him was a steel man. Right. And my uncle Keshav was going to focus on the automotive side. So their responsibilities were very clear. So even when I decided to rejoin business, it was the writing on the wall at that time, so to speak, was that I would take over Mahindra Eugene, if at all. Even though that wasn't clear, it depended on my performance.
Yes. Right. So what happened?
Well, I think what happened was that as Mahindra and Mahindra grew, succession issues came on the table. My uncle Keshav's children were not interested in coming into business. And then there was this episode that took place in the early 90s when there was a scare of a takeover.
An attempted takeover.
And of an attempted takeover. And I think at that time the board of Mahindra said, look, they fended off the takeover and they said, this is a time now to put succession in place.
When you took over at M&M, did you have the sense that you were going to run the company the best possible way? Or did you say to yourself, I now have an opportunity to do many different things?
Well, the funny thing was, don't forget that during the license Raj, you were not allowed to expand vertically. So because the dominant image of Mahindra is the Jeep maker, people don't understand that it was already into a number of businesses. I had led Mahindra Eugene into a number of other businesses simply because you couldn't expand vertically. I remember once in Mahindra Eugene, it was absurd. You come back in the 80s, and when we wanted to expand our alloy steel production, we were told by the government, fine, but surrender your stainless steel license. I mean, it's hard for you, for anyone young to understand what kind of bizarre environment that was. The frustrations. So what did you do? You grew horizontally. So I actually took Mahindra Eugene into real estate development and into budget hotels well before I joined Mahindra. And on the Mahindra side, there was a lot of things. There was nuclear engineering until, of course, the nuclear blast brought sanctions in. They were in Otis Elevator was part of the group. We were in Sintered Products, largely engineering. But even Tech Mahindra today had been started by the time I joined.
Right?
Yes, of course.
Nobody suspected that it would lead to Satyam and all of these things.
No, because it was working more as a sweatshop for British Telecom.
Weren't British Telecom partners in the
They still are. And it was their act, I give them credit, it was an act of foresight on their part to recognize that they could come and see India as an offshore destination. Mind you, that's before the whole IT miracle took place here. So
way before Bangalore became a household name in
and yet
every
we missed the
house.
boat, of course. So the British Telecom.
I want to come back and talk about that. But before that, I'm going to take a break, so don't go away.